Have you ever wondered what a medieval peasant ate during the day when food was so scarce and life was a struggle for survival? How could a simple man get the strength for hard labor and live in conditions of constant hunger and cold? In this video, we will tell you in detail what ordinary peasants ate, how they preserved food and fought against deprivation. If you are interested in history, survival, and life in harsh times, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are a lot of amazing and true stories from the past that you won't find in textbooks. A medieval peasant's morning began with a simple and modest breakfast, which was supposed to provide quick strength for a long and hard day's work. The main food on the table was coarse bread, flat bread made of rye or barley flour, often hard and dense, but it was the basis of the diet and provided the necessary carbohydrates. Instead of the variety we are accustomed to today for breakfast, medieval peasants limited themselves to what was available, most often a thick porridge cooked from oats, millet or barley, with no added sugar or spices, which were considered luxuries and saved for special occasions. These porridges were cooked with water or, if they could, with diluted milk. Milk was often in short supply because of the need to preserve it for making cheese and butter. Sometimes a little salt or onion was added to the porridge to improve the flavor a bit. But even such a modest meal was extremely important, because from the first hours of the day, there was physical work on which the whole family depended. Villagers and small settlements tried not to waste precious meat for breakfast, because it was too valuable and was most often used only on feast days or in case of illness. On ordinary days, meat was replaced with fish, legumes, or eggs if available. The peasants' breakfast was not just a meal, but an essential energy resource that allowed them to endure long hours in the field or forest, where they had to labor from dawn to dusk, often under harsh conditions. In some regions, such as England or Germany, historical records show that peasant families often had a breakfast that included so-called black bread and a chowder of vegetables or beans, a cheap but hearty meal that warmed and energized the body. In a harsh climate and constant food shortages, breakfast could be as simple as possible, even meager, but always nutritious and caloric enough to provide endurance and strength. The tradition of eating porridge and bread for breakfast has been preserved for centuries, as it was considered not only healthy, but also sustainable in terms of food storage. Grain could be preserved for a long time, and food prepared from it quickly satiated. In addition, conserving resources was an urgent necessity. Peasant families could not afford many luxuries, and every product was carefully distributed among family members to avoid hunger and disease. The lack of spices and sweets on the morning table reflected not only poverty, but also the harsh realities of life, where survival was more important than gustatory pleasures. Many chronicles of the time confirm that the morning meal was short so as not to delay the start of work, but at the same time carefully considered from the point of view of survival. Simple food provided a gradual recovery after a night's sleep, when the body needed energy to start metabolic processes and prepare for the day's exertions. Thus, the breakfast of a medieval peasant was not just a set of foods, but part of a survival ritual where every crumb mattered and taste gave way to meaning and usefulness. Although meager, the morning meal was a moment of calm and a brief respite as the family came together in preparation for the trials of the day. It was this simple breakfast that allowed the peasant to remain productive and preserve his strength to fight the cold, hunger, and hard physical labor. Water in medieval villages was rarely clean and safe to drink, forcing peasants to find other ways to quench their thirst. And it was often weak alcoholic beverages, such as beer and brogue, that figured prominently in their diet. Wells and springs were often polluted, especially in the summer when standing water became a source of disease. So even simple beer was seen not only as food, but also as a way to protect against infections and intestinal diseases. Beer in those days was much weaker than modern beer, with a low alcohol content, and even children drank it, as its preparation included boiling, which destroyed many harmful microorganisms. Historians note that medieval beer was a kind of substitute for water, because fermented beverages were preserved better and longer, which was important in the absence of refrigerators and difficult hygiene. Often the morning meal was accompanied by a mug of beer, which helped to keep you warm and energized. And in the evening, it became a way to relax after a hard day. In some regions, such as England and Germany, Brewing was so widespread that it was considered a natural part of peasant life, and beer recipes were passed down from generation to generation. Brugge made from grains or berries was also a popular drink, especially in the wintertime when fresh water froze and it was difficult to gather well. It was considered stronger and warmer, and was often drunk in small portions to avoid intoxication, as even weak alcohol reduced alertness in dangerous conditions. Often in medieval homes, vessels of kvass or herbal infusions stood next to beer and brugge, which also helped to quench thirst and maintain health. Village water was often drawn from wells, but due to deficiencies in sanitation, it could be the source of epidemics such as dysentery and cholera, which regularly claimed the lives of peasant families. Drinking beer and brugge was not just a cultural tradition, but a real measure of protection against disease. In this sense, these drinks fulfilled the function of prevention and medical care. In the annals of those times, it is often mentioned that beer was perceived as liquid bread because in terms of nutritional value, it replaced part of the food and could maintain the strength of a person. In addition, weak alcoholic beverages kept them warm on cold winter nights, helping them to endure harsh weather conditions, which was important for survival in the difficult climatic conditions of medieval Europe. Their consumption was strictly rationed so as not to impair performance, but to keep the body in tone, especially during the cold seasons when the strain on the body was at its highest. It is worth noting that the quality of beverages depended heavily on the skill of brewers and on the availability of grain, which became scarce in years of poor harvests, which affected the strength and flavor of beer. Nevertheless, brewing remained an important craft, often supported by the local nobility and monasteries, which produced the best varieties that even simple peasants could be proud of. At a time when clean water was a luxury and simple hygiene a privilege, beer and brugge helped peasants stay healthy and strong, allowing them to endure daily hardship, cold, and hunger. Historical chronicles and archaeological finds confirm that beverages were an integral part of life, and their role went far beyond the simple need to quench thirst. The main meal of the medieval peasant's life was lunch, which was most often a stew or thick porridge made from whatever could be grown or gathered. Such meals were simple to prepare, but incredibly important for survival. They satiated, warmed, and gave strength for hard physical labor. Depending on the region and the season, recipes for chowder varied, but the basis was always cereals. Barley, oats, rye, and legumes such as peas and lentils, which are rich in protein and could replace meat. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, carrots, were often added to chowder, giving it flavor and richness, while seasonal vegetables, cabbage, onions, garlic, made the dish more nutritious and healthy. A peculiarity of medieval cuisine was that even the simplest dishes were often prepared with great skill. All leftover food was carefully processed so as not to throw anything away. The remains of yesterday's porridge could become the basis for a new dish, and hardened bread was soaked in water or in chowder so that it would soften and become edible again. Historical sources indicate that chowder was not only a meal, but also a social phenomenon. Families gathered around a common cauldron where everyone could take their portion, and this united people in their difficult lives. These meals provided the right calories and nutrients to help them survive the cold months and work in the fields from early morning to late evening. Chowder was often cooked over an open fire in large cauldrons with all sorts of ingredients mixed in, from root vegetables to herbs and even a little meat or fish if you were lucky. Although modest, the dishes were varied in flavor. Sometimes spices were added to the chowder if they were available, or sour berries were added, giving the flavor a touch of freshness. The water in which porridge and chowder was boiled was not always crystal clear, so a handful of salt was often added, which helped in both preservation and flavor enhancement. In winter, the food could be poor. Then the table was mostly porridge made of dry grains or flour, cooked on water or diluted milk, if the livestock allowed. Economy and rationality were the main rule. Any amount of food, especially meat and fish, was worth its weight in gold. So even bones and skin were used to make broths that nourished and warmed the whole family. In medieval peasant life, meat was the exception rather than the rule, and its presence in the diet was always considered a sign of good fortune or wealth, because ordinary people could rarely afford fresh meat products. The main sources of meat for peasants were livestock: cows, pigs, chickens, which were kept for milk, eggs, and labor, and meat often appeared only after the slaughter of an animal in case of emergency or holiday. Hunting of wild animals was severely restricted or outright forbidden for peasants in most regions, as the lands belonged to the nobility, and only a few could afford hunting rights or obtain game surreptitiously, risking heavy penalties. When meat appeared on the table, it was most often in salted, cured, or dried form. Preservation methods allowed the product to be kept longer in the absence of refrigeration, and this is how meat became an important source of protein in winter or during hunger seasons. Salted meats were soaked before cooking, drawing out the salt, while cured and dried meats could simply be sliced and eaten, sometimes added to chowder or porridge to enhance flavor and nutritional value. Meat in a peasant's diet was a symbol of a special occasion. It often appeared on religious holidays, weddings, important family celebrations, or after a successful hunt. Medieval manuscripts and chronicles describe scenes of festive feasts where meat served not only as food, but also as an object of social status, emphasizing belonging to the community and respect for guests. For peasants, however, the daily diet was modest, and they often had to make do with the bones and skin of slaughtered cattle, from which they boiled broth, a valuable source of nutrients in harsh conditions. In years of poor harvests or wars, meat became even more scarce, and the diet of many was reduced to grain and vegetable dishes, where only a slice of ham or a piece of game was dreamed of. Nevertheless, the methods of salting and drying, passed down from generation to generation, allowed peasants to at least occasionally obtain much-needed animal nutrition, keeping them strong and healthy in harsh conditions. Archaeological evidence points to the use of wooden barrels and salt pits to store meat, indicating advanced preservation practices even in simple villages. Meat was sometimes substituted for fish, especially in coastal areas or near rivers where fishing was an additional source of food and protein. From the point of view of survival, the presence of meat in the diet provided a supply of essential amino acids and vitamins that could not be obtained from cereals and vegetables alone, making this product indispensable in cold and difficult seasons. In monasteries and castles, where the diet was more varied, meat had a more prominent place, emphasizing the social stratification of medieval society, but for the peasant, it remained a delicacy and a rare luxury. That is why, when meat appeared, it was eaten leisurely with respect for the product, realizing that tomorrow it might not be there. Thus, meat in the medieval peasant diet was not only food, but also a symbol of hope, celebration, and a rare respite from the harsh everyday life, confirming how hard life was for those who survived on the land during the Middle Ages. In medieval Europe, fish was one of the few available sources of protein for peasants, especially those who lived close to rivers, lakes, or the sea, where fishing was an important part of daily life and provided a significant part of the diet. In coastal areas and along large rivers, peasants were eager to fish, using simple gear, nets, rods, traps, and even special troughs for catching oyster mushrooms and other small fish. Often fish were caught by the whole village, which became both a necessity and a form of collective labor that united the community in harsh times. Since fresh fish spoiled quickly, farmers developed various ways of preserving it, drying, salting, and curing fish to have a supply for the cold months or periods of crop failure. Dried and salted fish played the role of not only food, but also goods for exchange, and sometimes became part of religious ceremonies, because according to church laws in Lent, fish was one of the few allowed products of animal origin. Dried fish, especially cod and herring, were stored in wooden chests or hung in well-ventilated rooms so as not to lose flavor and remain edible for a long time. Fish was especially important in regions where raising livestock was difficult due to climate or poor soils, and it was there that it provided the necessary balance of proteins and fats in the peasant's diet. In monasteries and among monks, fish had a special place, for many religious rules forbade the consumption of meat on certain days, making fish an indispensable product, which also influenced the rural diet, as monasteries often supplied fish to the surrounding villages. Archaeological excavations show the remains of fish bones in medieval settlements, confirming the regular consumption of fish, as well as the variety of species, from river pike and crucian carp to sea cod and herring. Sometimes fish was added to chowder or porridge to increase the nutritional value of the dish and to diversify the flavor, especially in season when fresh fish was abundant. Fish served as an important supplement to vegetable food, enriching the diet with vitamins and necessary microelements, which allowed peasants to maintain health and stamina during hard physical labor. Despite the importance of fish, however, catching and processing them were labor-intensive processes, and access to rich fishing grounds was often regulated by feudal lords, limiting the peasants' options. Understanding these aspects shows how fish was not just food, but part of a complex social and economic system affecting the lives and survival of ordinary people during the Middle Ages. Fish as a source of protein became a symbol of human adaptation to the environment, demonstrating how natural resources and traditional knowledge allowed peasants to survive in difficult times. Thus, fish occupied a place of no less importance in the medieval peasant diet than cereal crops, and was an indispensable product that kept whole generations alive and healthy in the harsh conditions of the Middle Ages. In the medieval diet, bread and cereals occupied a key place, without which it is simply impossible to imagine the life of a peasant, because it was from grain that the main food was grown, which provided strength for hard physical labor and supported the body in the harsh winter months. Types of bread ranged from coarse flatbreads made from unseasoned grain, resembling more hard stones, to softer and more nutritious bread made from refined flour, generally available only to the richer classes. For most peasants, rye or barley flour was the staple, as wheat grew worse on poor soils, and the quality of bread depended heavily on the season, the harvest, and the milling technology, which was often primitive and coarse. Bread was not just a separate meal, but served as a kind of spoon. A piece of bread was often dipped in chowder or soup to avoid wasting a drop of food, and sometimes simply served as a substitute for cutlery in conditions of poverty and lack of amenities. In addition to bread, cereal grains were used to make porridge and chowder, which could be cooked from oats, barley, or millet, depending on the region and climate. These dishes were dense and nutritious, allowing for long-lasting energy, but they often seemed bland and boring, so the addition of herbs, roots, or a little salt became a rare but welcome variety. Grain played another vital role: storage and winter survival. Well-dried grain and flour stored in granaries and barns provided months of supplies, helping to stave off starvation when there was little or no fresh food. Medieval barns and granaries were structures with thick walls and minimal ventilation to protect the grain from moisture and rodents, for loss of supplies could mean disaster for an entire family or community. At the same time, bread and grain crops became a kind of currency in the rural economy. They were used to pay for labor, to feed people on barcaina, and to exchange with neighbors. It is known that the quality and quantity of bread directly reflected the standard of living. When the bread was dark and hard, it spoke of scarcity and hunger, and when the flour was white and clean, of prosperity. Since peasants often lacked access to a variety of food, bread served not only as satiation, but also as a psychological support, a familiar food that accompanied them from day to day. It is also an important fact that bread in the Middle Ages had a symbolic meaning associated with religious rites and daily rituals. It was respected and cherished, and the loss of a piece of bread was considered bad luck, which once again emphasizes its importance for survival and well-being. For the medieval peasant, vegetables and legumes were an essential part of the daily diet because they provided an affordable and relatively easy source of vitamins and nutrients that were often lacking in other foods. The main vegetables grown in the courtyard gardens were cabbage, turnips, carrots, and onions, crops that were resistant to cold and could be preserved for long periods of time, which was especially valuable during the harsh winter months when fresh produce was almost non-existent. In addition, legumes, peas, lentils, and beans were important in the diet, which not only enriched the food with protein, but also helped to maintain satiety when meat was scarce, and their cultivation did not require large expenditures on land or seeds. Historical chronicles indicate that legumes were one of the few crops that could grow on poor and depleted soils, making them indispensable for the survival of the poorest of the poor. Peas and beans were cooked in thick chowder, sometimes adding leftover vegetables or a small amount of salt, making a nutritious and warm dish that could sustain strength for a whole day of hard work. Many researchers of medieval cuisine note that cabbage grown in villages was used not only fresh, but also sauerkraut, which allowed to preserve its vitamins and nutritional properties throughout the long winter when the body needed additional protection from avidominosis. Vegetables and legumes also played an important role in fighting hunger, when crop failures or wars led to shortages of grain and meat. In such times, peas and beans were the staple food, cooked in large cauldrons and shared among the whole family, which helped them survive in the most difficult times. There are known cases when peasants, experiencing acute hunger, even gathered wild legumes and greens to somehow make up for the lack of nutrients, despite the risk of poisoning or gastric disorders. In addition, vegetables and legumes had symbolic meaning in the culture. For example, cabbage was often associated with simplicity and industriousness, and its abundance on the table was considered a sign of prosperity and wealth, albeit modest. While protein components derived from meat were rare, it was plant foods that helped peasants maintain health and stamina, giving them the strength for hard labor in the fields and on the farm. In medieval peasant life, spices and condiments were a rarity rather than a permanent attribute of the table, because most exotic spices, such as pepper, cinnamon, or cloves, were brought to Europe by expensive caravans from distant countries and were available mainly to the rich. However, even simple peasants had certain herbs and spices at their disposal, which they could gather from the forests or grow in their vegetable gardens. Onions, garlic, parsley, dill, and thyme were often used to enhance the flavor of simple dishes and give them some freshness. These herbs not only added flavor, but also had practical value. Many of them had antiseptic and anti-inflammatory properties, which helped preserve food longer and prevent it from spoiling in the absence of refrigerators. Historical sources confirm that onions and garlic, being cheap and available, were an obligatory part of the peasant's diet, and their use was perceived not only as a gastronomic pleasure, but also as a prophylactic for various diseases, which in the conditions of medieval medicine was of great importance. For peasant families, the use of spices was often limited to the seasons, when dried herbs or fresh bulbs could be self-prepared, and during the winter months, meals became as simple and bland as possible, with no aromatic additives. Seasonings, even in the form of herbs and onions, transformed ordinary chowder and porridge into heartier and more palatable dishes, keeping morale up in the harsh conditions of life. Salted foods had a special place, as salt was not only a seasoning, but also an indispensable preservative for meat, fish, and vegetables, thus ensuring the preservation of stocks for many months. Salting and curing, which were widely used in rural households, significantly extended the shelf life of foods, making the diet more varied and nutritious in winter. Despite the relatively modest use of spices, even a small amount of spices could significantly improve the flavor of meager food, creating the illusion of wealth and prosperity. The social status of spices was very high. For the nobility and wealthy city dwellers, their presence on the table was a symbol of wealth and connection to distant lands, while for the peasants, they remained a luxury item that could only be dreamed of. There are known cases when expensive spices became a kind of currency or gifts passed between strata of society, emphasizing their value and rarity. At the same time, simple herbs and onions were both condiments and medicines, and a symbol of the practicality and endurance of peasants who knew how to use whatever nature had to offer near their homes. In the medieval peasant home, sweets were a real luxury, not available to everyone, and even the simplest sweet treats were perceived as a rare and desirable pleasure, because sugar at that time was so expensive and scarce commodity that it was used almost exclusively by the nobility and clergy. Instead of sugar, peasants relied on natural sources of sweetness, mainly honey, which they extracted themselves or traded at the market, and forest berries such as blueberries, raspberries, and strawberries, which were picked in season and consumed fresh or in the form of jam, but always very carefully and sparingly. Honey served not only as a sweetener, but also as a medicine. Its properties were known since ancient times, and it was used to treat colds and wounds, which made honey an indispensable product in everyday life. Historical records show that nuts, especially walnuts and hazelnuts, also had an important place in the diet, adding pleasant flavor and calories, but they were harvested and consumed with care because supplies were limited and dependent on the harvest. On rare holidays, such as Christmas or Easter, peasants could afford more elaborate treats, including the simplest pies with berries or honey, which were made from coarse dough, often with the addition of eggs and milk if available. These pies and sweet dishes were seen as an iconic event that gave special meaning to the celebration, and their preparation was often a collective endeavor associated with traditions and rituals. Everyday life was devoid of the desserts familiar to modern man. There were no candies, chocolates, and other delights, and sweet dishes were too expensive and considered a luxury item, so most peasants were satisfied with only tiny doses of sweets throughout the year. During famine years or periods of crop failure, even honey became rare, and children and adults experienced an acute shortage of sweet taste, which affected not only mood, but also the general state of health. In addition to honey and berries, dried fruits brought from the south were sometimes consumed, but they were few and expensive. The social significance of sweets was great. The ability to prepare and serve a sweet dish at a feast or important event symbolized the status and prosperity of the family, and the absence of such treats often emphasized the need and modesty of peasant life. Church fasts, which were regularly observed in the Middle Ages, restricted the consumption of dairy and meat products, so sweets often became the only small joy during the period of abstinence. In general, sweets were more a symbol of celebration and exclusion from the rigors of everyday life than an everyday necessity, which put its own imprint on the psychology and food culture of ordinary people. In the harsh conditions of medieval peasant life, night meals and snacks played an important role, especially during periods of hunger and hard physical labor, when food supplies were limited and the body required additional energy to maintain endurance. Often the night snacks were leftovers from the morning or afternoon meal. Small pieces of bread, some raw or cooked vegetables, and dry crusts or hardened bread that had been warmed over a fire to make it at least somewhat edible. Occasionally they could get some boiled chowder or diluted porridge, which they took with them to work and finished in the evening, trying not to waste even the most meager resources, because each piece of food could save a life in the winter months or years of crop failure. Historical sources tell us that peasants often ate at night if they worked late at night. This helped to conserve energy, especially during the sowing or harvesting season, when the physical strain was enormous and required constant replenishment of energy. Snacking helped avoid blood sugar spikes and helped the body keep warm in cold and poorly heated homes, where the nighttime cold became a harsh experience. In the worst periods, when hunger was rampant, the night meal could be limited to a sip of water or a weak decoction of herbs. But even this was seen as a help, although it did not solve all the problems of survival. It is important to realize that eating regular meals, even small portions, played a key role in maintaining health, as chronic malnutrition led to weakness, frequent illness, and reduced ability to work, which in turn added to the plight of entire families. In addition, there are known cases when peasants consumed tree bark, ate raw bulbs and root vegetables in raw form, trying to extract some nutritional value in times of acute food shortages. Night snacks often became a psychological support. Even a small piece of bread could give a sense of security and hope for a better tomorrow, which was important in the endless workdays and constant struggle for survival. The doctors of that time, as far as the chronicle allows us to judge, advised to conserve strength and, if possible, to eat small portions more often, which in their opinion helped to preserve health in the harsh conditions of life of the common people. Snacks, though modest, sometimes included weak beer or brogue, which not only quenched thirst but also aided digestion and kept them warm on cold nights. The life of a medieval peasant was filled with hardship, and his diet reflected the harsh reality of the time. Every grain, every piece of meat or root was essential for survival. Despite its scarcity and monotony, food was the strength that kept them going, working and hoping for a better future. Understanding how people lived and survived in the past helps us to appreciate what we have today and gain a deeper understanding of human resilience and ingenuity. If you like this video, please like and share it with your friends. Let's keep the memory of the true heroes of history alive together.